What if a man's last $15 didn't buy him failure, but a secret waiting in the dark? When Ethan Cole pushed open the rotten door of a forgotten barn, he froze in shock. A pair of eyes stared back. A wild horse marked with scars of fire and storms. From that moment, his life unraveled into mystery, survival, and the fragile bond between man, community, and a Mustang who refused to be forgotten. The wind cut down Main Street like a blade, carrying with it the scent of rust, snow, and something long forgotten. The town of Bridger Ridge, Montana, looked more like a memory than a place where life still clung on. Storefronts with peeling paint leaned against one another, their signs rattling in the dry gusts of February. The only movement came from a crowd gathered in front of the old general store, where an auctioneer's voice rang sharp against the stillness of the dying town. Ethan Cole stood at the edge of the group, his hands deep in the frayed pockets of a denim jacket too thin for the season. His boots, cracked and worn from years of work and winters, left shallow impressions in the crust of dirty snow. He wasn't here out of choice. He was here because his truck had broken down 3 towns back, and because $15 was all he had left in the world. $15. Less than the cost of a hot meal for a family. Less than a single pair of new boots. Yet, in this forgotten town, $15 might just buy him shelter. A barn, even a broken one, meant a roof and 4 walls to keep out the cold. It meant a place to stop running. "Next lot," the auctioneer barked, his voice echoing across the boarded-up windows. "Old barn property out by the creek bed. Half an acre, no water rights, no utilities, no road access worth speaking of. Let's start the bidding at 20. The crowd chuckled. A woman in a red scarf whispered something that made 2 men laugh, their voices dry and brittle like the wind. Nobody raised a hand. Nobody wanted a barn sagging into the earth, not in this valley where the mines had closed and the trains no longer passed. 20 went unanswered. Silence filled the space where ambition used to live. Ethan shifted on his heels, staring at the paper in his hand. A rough map, sketched in pencil, showing a rectangle marked simply as barn. Something about it pulled at him. Maybe it was the word itself. Barn. He had grown up in barns, lived his childhood between haylofts and the smell of horses. Those were better years, before storms stripped his farm bare, before debts took the house, before the mistakes that haunted him. He looked up at the auctioneer and heard his own voice before he meant to speak. 15. Heads turned. A few eyebrows lifted. The auctioneer squinted at him, his bolo tie glinting in the pale light. 15? He let the word hang in the air. Do I hear 16? Silence again. Only the creak of a sign swaying overhead. The cough of someone in the back. The town had no appetite for ruins. 15 going once. The gavel hovered in the air. Going twice. The sound of wood striking wood cracked through the cold. Sold. To the gentleman in the blue shirt. Ethan lowered his head, his throat tight. For the first time in months, he owned something, even if it was nothing more than splintered wood and shadows. He signed the papers with ink that smudged across his calloused fingers. The old auctioneer gave him a long look, not unkind. That place has been waiting a long time, son. Take care you find more than you bargained for. By the time the crowd dispersed, the sun was sliding behind the ridge, staining the sky with thin streaks of rose. Ethan slung his duffel bag over his shoulder and began the walk. 3 miles through frozen fields, his breath a steady fog before him. The barn revealed itself slowly, a hulking silhouette against the dying light. It leaned to one side, as though the wind had worn it down to its bones. The wood was bleached gray by decades of Montana winters, the roof sagging but still intact. It looked as tired as Ethan felt. He stopped a few paces away, the silence pressing in. No traffic, no voices, no sign of life except the moan of wind through brittle sage. He pushed open the door. The hinges screamed, and dust swirled in a shaft of golden light. He took one step inside, then froze. In the far corner stood a horse. It was gray, the same color as ash after fire, ribs faintly showing beneath a coat dulled by neglect. Its ears twitched, its dark eyes fixed on him with an intensity that rooted him to the spot. This was no skeleton of wood and stone he had bought. This was life, breathing, waiting, silent. Ethan's heart pounded. He swallowed hard, afraid to move. He hadn't expected company. Yet here it was, a creature as out of place and forsaken as he was. The horse did not shy away. It did not bolt. It simply stood, as if it had been waiting for him. Ethan let out a shaky breath, the words rough in his throat. "Well," he whispered, "guess neither of us expected this." The horse flicked its ears forward, and the distance between man and animal shrank, not by steps, but by something far quieter. A recognition. A mirror held up in the dusk. Ethan realized then that $15 had bought him more than a roof. It had bought him a mystery, a responsibility, maybe even a second chance. And as the door creaked shut behind him, sealing the cold out and the silence in, he understood. Nothing in his life would be the same after this night. The barn smelled of dust, dry hay, and time. Ethan stood in the half-light, unsure if the creature before him was real or some vision conjured by hunger and exhaustion. The horse shifted, a slow motion that stirred the air and sent a small cloud of dust spiraling upward. Its coat was the color of burnt wood, streaked with grime, yet there was a quiet dignity in the way it held its head. Thin though it was, its frame hinted at strength that had endured storms. Ethan took one cautious step forward, boots pressing against the dirt floor. The horse did not retreat. Its eyes, dark, reflective pools, watched him steadily, unblinking. He could almost feel the weight of its gaze, heavy, as if it carried more than the silent barn could hold. Ethan lifted a hand, hesitated, then slowly pulled his jacket tighter around himself instead. He had learned once, long ago, that rushing a horse only deepened its fear. Patience was all he had left to offer. The wind outside pressed against the boards, rattling loose planks with a hollow moan. The horse's ears flicked, attuned to every sound. When Ethan shifted his weight, the animal's nostrils flared, catching the scent of man, of sweat, and travel, and something broken. He lowered his voice, rough as sandpaper. "I don't have much either," he said. "But maybe it's enough for both of us." He set his duffel bag down and pulled out a can of beans, one of 3 he owned. With the edge of his pocket knife, he pried the lid open, the metallic click echoing unnaturally loud. The horse stiffened at the noise, muscles taut beneath its dusty hide. Ethan froze, waiting. Slowly, the tension drained from the animal's body, though its eyes never left him. He emptied half the beans into a rusty bucket he'd found by the door and slid it across the floor. The horse lowered its head, sniffed cautiously, then began to eat. Each bite was deliberate, quiet, as though it knew to savor what little it was given. Watching the creature eat, Ethan felt an ache rise in his chest, sharp and unexpected. He had fed animals before, on ranches in Texas, in stables back east, but this was different. This was not duty or work. This was survival, shared between two souls who had nothing left but the present moment. The sound of beans against the bucket was strangely comforting. When the last bite was gone, the horse lifted its head. For a heartbeat, their eyes met in the golden shaft of moonlight breaking through the roof. Ethan saw something there. Not gratitude, not trust yet, but a flicker of recognition, as if the animal had marked him in its memory. The horse exhaled, a soft rush of warm air, and stepped back into shadow. Ethan spread his bedroll on the opposite side of the barn. The floor was hard, the cold unforgiving, but the presence of another living being near him made it bearable. As he lay staring at the rafters, the horse shifted in the darkness, its breathing steady, like a second heartbeat in the night. Coyotes howled somewhere far off, their cries carrying across the frozen valley. The horse's ears twitched, but it did not panic. It stood like a sentinel, as though keeping watch. For the first time in years, Ethan did not feel completely alone. Sleep pulled at him slowly, but before his eyes closed, he whispered into the dark. "Guess I'll call you Ash," he said. "Seems fitting." The name settled into the silence like a vow. When morning came, light bled into the barn through the cracks in the boards, sharp and white against the shadows. Ash was awake, standing near the door, ears pricked forward as though listening for something beyond the human ear. Ethan groaned and sat up, his joints stiff, his mouth dry with the metallic taste of cold. He pushed himself to his feet, brushing hay and dust from his shirt. The horse turned its head slightly, regarding him again with that same unreadable gaze. "You hear something, don't you?" Ethan muttered. He crossed the floor, boots stirring the dirt. Ash pawed at the ground with one hoof, a slow, deliberate motion. The sound was rhythmic, purposeful. Ethan crouched down, running his calloused hand over the disturbed patch of earth. The dirt there felt softer, looser than the rest of the floor. His fingers brushed something hard beneath the surface. Wood. Not ground, but planks buried beneath years of dust and neglect. Ethan cleared more away, revealing the faint outline of floorboards. He glanced up at the horse, whose dark eyes followed his every move. "You knew this was here, didn't you?" Ash gave a quiet snort, almost like an answer. Ethan dug deeper, loosening the dirt until he could lift one of the boards. It creaked, protesting, but came up in his hands, revealing a shallow space beneath. A cavity carved into the hard earth. Inside lay a rusted tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Ethan's hands trembled as he lifted it out. Dust coated his palms, the weight heavier than it should have been for something so small. He sat against the wall, the box in his lap, and pried open the latch. It resisted, groaning like it hadn't been touched in decades. At last, it gave way with a sharp snap. Inside were a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, and beneath them, a brass key with an ornate head. Ethan lifted one envelope carefully. The paper was yellowed, the handwriting a delicate script. He read the first line aloud, his voice rough in the morning air. "My dearest Jay." The words blurred. He blinked hard, his throat tightening. He looked up at Ash, who stood silently, eyes fixed on him. In that moment, the barn didn't feel abandoned. It felt inhabited by something larger, something that reached through time. Ash took a step closer, the sound of its hoof against the dirt steady and grounding. Ethan held the letter in his hands and felt the enormity of the moment press down on him. $15 had given him a barn. But what he had really bought was a secret, a story buried in dust, and a horse that seemed to know more than it should. He exhaled, the word almost a whisper. "Why me?" The horse lowered its head, breathing against his shoulder as if to steady him. Ethan closed his eyes, holding the letter as though it might burn through his palms. Outside, the wind picked up again, rattling the boards. Inside, silence deepened, binding man and horse to the weight of the mystery they had uncovered. Together. The morning light settled gently through the cracks of the old barn, laying thin stripes of gold across the dirt floor. Ethan sat with the tin box by his side, his mind still circling around the letters he had discovered. Words written decades earlier lingered in his head, like ghosts whispering from another time. But it wasn't only the box that demanded his attention. It was the horse, Ash, standing quietly nearby, as though he had carried the weight of those secrets all along. Ethan rose slowly, stretching his stiff back. Ash watched him, ears twitching at each sound. When Ethan stepped closer, the horse shifted his weight, but did not retreat. It was then Ethan noticed something more, something half hidden beneath the dust and dull coat. Along Ash's neck, faintly visible in the light, was a brand. Not the fiery scar of ranch stock, but the faded outline of numbers burned into the hide with cold iron. A freeze brand. Ethan's chest tightened. He reached out, stopping short of contact, letting his hand hover inches above the mark. The horse stood still, his breath steaming in the cool air, eyes fixed forward as if resigned to being examined. Ethan lowered his hand, brushing gently across the raised, white-frosted lines. He whispered to himself, "Where did you come from?" The mark was no accident. Somewhere, sometime, Ash had belonged. To a program, to a registry, to people who had chosen him and somehow lost him. Ethan felt a pang in his stomach. He knew what it meant to be marked by the past, to carry scars that others could not see. Ash bore his visibly, while Ethan's were hidden beneath years of mistakes. He pulled his hand away and stepped back, pacing across the barn. He thought about the life he had drifted through, ranches from Texas to Wyoming, day labor that left nothing behind but tired muscles and unpaid bills. He thought of his ex-wife's last words, "You never stay long enough to fix anything." The memory stung. He looked back at the horse and said softly, "Maybe this time I should stay." The wind outside shifted, carrying the sound of tires on gravel. Ethan froze, listening. A knock echoed against the barn door. Ash's ears flicked back, muscles tightening. Ethan approached cautiously, pulling the door open. A woman stood there, bundled in a heavy coat, her dark hair pulled back, eyes sharp and alert. She introduced herself with a firm voice. "Dr. Maya Green. The auctioneer said you bought this place." Ethan hesitated, then nodded. "That's right." "You're a vet?" "Traveling one," she replied. Her gaze moved past him, landing on Ash. Her brows knit, and she stepped forward without waiting for permission. Ash shifted uneasily, but Maya raised her hands slowly, speaking low and steady. "Easy, boy. I'm not here to hurt you." Ethan watched, unsure whether to intervene. Maya circled the horse, her hands gentle but sure, like someone who had spoken this language for years. When her eyes fell on the freeze brand, she traced it lightly with her fingertips. "This isn't just any horse," she murmured. "This brand means he was once part of the Wild Horse program. He's a Mustang." The word carried weight. Ethan stared at her, then back at Ash. Mustang. Untamed blood, shaped by mountains and storms, not bred in stables, not softened by generations of captivity, but forged in the raw freedom of the American West. It explained the intelligence in his eyes, the caution, the dignity. "Do you know where he came from?" Ethan asked. Maya shook her head. "Not without looking up the records. Each mark tells a story, but I'd need the charts to match it. Still, he shouldn't be here alone. Someone either abandoned him or he escaped." Ash flicked his ears at the sound of her voice, then lowered his head slightly, as if acknowledging her. Maya stepped back and crossed her arms. "He's lucky you found him." Ethan wanted to laugh, but the sound wouldn't come. "Lucky? I barely have a place for myself." Her eyes softened. Sometimes the ones with the least still end up giving the most. She glanced at the letters still in Ethan's lap. "And sometimes we stumble on things that were never meant for us, but need us anyway." For a long moment, the barn was quiet except for the horse shifting his hooves on the dirt. The letters rustled in the draft, fragile threads of history tying themselves to the present. Ethan looked at Maya, then at Ash. He felt the strange pull again, the sense that this place had been waiting for him, not by accident, but by some thread of design. When Maya finally left, promising to check on records once she returned to Wyoming, Ethan stayed with Ash. He set his hand gently on the horse's neck again, over the cold brand, and Ash didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned just slightly into the touch, enough to break the silence between them. Ethan closed his eyes and breathed out. "I don't know what you've been through," he said, "but maybe we can figure it out together." Ash lifted his head, exhaling softly, his breath curling into the chill like a whispered answer. For Ethan, it was the smallest beginning, but it was enough. The storm had thinned overnight, leaving the valley wrapped in a brittle hush. Snow lay like a pale quilt over the ground, broken only by sagebrush and the faint tracks of deer. The barn, weathered but standing, looked almost softened beneath the frost. Ethan stepped outside, his boots sinking into the crust of snow, breath white against the morning air. Ash leaned against the half-open door behind him, ears flicking, watching as if uncertain the world beyond the barn belonged to him anymore. The sound of an approaching truck broke the stillness. Tires crunched on gravel, the low rumble carrying across the empty road. Ethan stiffened, instinctively drawing his jacket tighter. Few people came out this far without reason. He turned as an old pickup rattled to a stop. From the cab stepped a man bundled in a heavy coat, his face lined by years of sun and wind. His hat was pulled low, his gait stiff but steady. "You must be Cole," the stranger said, his voice roughened by age and cigarettes. Ethan nodded, cautious. "That's right. Who's asking?" The man extended a gloved hand. "Walt Hargrove. Used to ride rodeo back in the 60s. Now I run a little spread up the ridge. Folks in town said a drifter bought the old barn. Figured I'd see for myself." Ethan hesitated, then shook his hand. Walt's grip was firm, steady, carrying a weight of old calluses and unspoken stories. His eyes shifted past Ethan, toward the barn where Ash stood like a gray shadow in the doorway. The old cowboy whistled low. "Well, I'll be damned. You got yourself a Mustang." Ethan frowned. "So I've been told." Walt stepped closer, his boots crunching in the snow. He tipped his hat back, eyes narrowing as he studied Ash. "Freeze brand on the neck. Seen a few like him. Wild stock, tough as the land they're born on. But that one," he paused, nodding slowly, "that one's different. He ain't just surviving. He's waiting." Ash flicked his ears at the stranger's voice, nostrils flaring. He didn't retreat, though his muscles quivered just beneath the surface. Walt chuckled softly. "Smart horse. Smarter than most men I know." Ethan shifted uneasily, unused to the intrusion. "You came all this way just to tell me that?" "Not exactly." Walt reached into his coat and pulled out a folded map, edges yellowed from years of use. "Old survey lines. Barn you bought sits right on the edge of what used to be grazing country. My father told me stories about this valley. Families, feuds, horses that vanished in the snow. Thought you might want to know where you stand." Ethan unfolded the map inside the barn, laying it across a hay bale. The paper smelled of dust and old tobacco. Faint pencil marks crisscrossed the land, borders drawn and erased over decades. Walt tapped one spot with a calloused finger. "That's here. And that horse," he glanced at Ash again, "might not be here by accident. Some things circle back, even when you think they're gone for good." Ethan traced the lines with his finger, the weight of the tin box in his memory pressing against him. The letters, the key, the mark on Ash's neck. It was too much coincidence. He closed the map and handed it back. "All I wanted was a roof, not history lessons." Walt gave a dry smile. "History has a way of finding you, son. Best you know that before it bites." The old man left as quietly as he'd come, the pickup rumbling back down the road until it vanished into the horizon. Ethan stood in the doorway long after the sound faded, snow crunching softly beneath his boots. Ash shifted beside him, lowering his head until his breath brushed Ethan's sleeve. The gesture was small, almost imperceptible, but it steadied him. That night, as wind rattled the boards again, Ethan lay awake on his bedroll, staring into the dark. Ash stood watch in the corner, the faint outline of his frame blending into shadow. Ethan whispered to the stillness, his voice caught between disbelief and hope. "What are you trying to show me?" The horse did not move, but the barn felt less empty, as though the question had already been heard. The days grew longer, though the cold still clung stubbornly to the valley. Ethan worked quietly on patching the worst holes in the barn with scraps of timber he scavenged from nearby fences. Each hammer strike echoed through the emptiness, startling Ash at first, but over time the horse grew used to the rhythm. He would watch with calm eyes, his ears twitching, as though measuring Ethan's patience nail by nail. On the fourth afternoon, as the sky carried the faint promise of thaw, Ethan heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow outside. Not heavy, not deliberate. Light, uncertain. He stepped to the door, expecting Walt again, or maybe Maya returning with her questions. Instead, a girl stood there, bundled in an oversized coat, a knit cap pulled low over her ears. She looked no more than 15. In her hands was a dog-eared paperback, the cover faded, almost white. "Sorry," she said quickly, her breath curling in the cold. "I didn't mean to bother you. I just..." Heard there was a horse here. Ethan studied her warily. And who told you that? She shrugged. Everyone in town knows. They say you're keeping some Mustang in the old barn. Most folks think you're crazy. She hesitated, biting her lip, then added, I wanted to see for myself. Behind him, Ash shifted, snorting softly as if he'd heard his own mention. The girl's eyes widened at the sound. She clutched the book tighter. Can I read to him? The request caught Ethan off guard. Read? To a horse? Her chin lifted, defiant despite her timid frame. Back home, I used to read to my dog when the fire alarm scared me. It helped me too. Animals listen different than people do. They don't interrupt. She glanced past him into the barn. Maybe he'd like it. Ethan considered sending her away. He had enough on his shoulders without a child hanging around. But something in her eyes, an echo of loneliness he recognized too well, kept him silent. He stepped aside. Go ahead. She entered slowly, boots scuffing against the dirt. Ash raised his head, ears flicking forward. The girl didn't approach directly. Instead, she sat cross-legged a safe distance away and opened her book. Her voice, though unsteady at first, filled the barn with gentle cadence. It wasn't the words themselves, some old adventure novel, pages frayed with time, but the sound of them, soft and steady, flowing like water into the silence. Ash did not move for several minutes. Then, gradually, he lowered his head. His ears angled toward the sound, his body loosening as though the girl's voice was something familiar, something he hadn't realized he missed. His eyelids dropped halfway, and he exhaled in a long, slow breath. Ethan watched from the shadows, struck by the quiet magic of it. He had spent days offering food, patience, his own silence. Yet in minutes, this girl had drawn something from the horse that he hadn't seen before. Release. Trust was still far away, but recognition. Yes, there was recognition in the way Ash's muscles eased, in the way his ears followed each word. The girl finished a chapter and closed the book, her hands trembling slightly. See? She whispered, more to herself than anyone else. He listens. Ethan nodded slowly. What's your name? June, she said. June Parker. I'm staying with my aunt for a while. After the fire back in California, well, she thought I needed space. She hugged the book tighter. Sometimes I still hear the alarms, even when they're not there. Ash stepped forward, one cautious stride, then stopped. The girl froze, her eyes wide. Ethan held his breath. Ash lowered his head again, closer this time, and chuffed softly through his nostrils. June smiled, tears glistening in the corners of her eyes. He knows, she said. He knows what it's like to be scared. Ethan felt something in his chest loosen, like a knot pulled too tight for too long. He looked at the horse, then at the girl, and realized that in this broken barn, all three of them carried wounds that words alone couldn't mend. Yet here, in the fragile act of reading aloud, healing had begun to take root. The sun dipped low, staining the snow outside with strokes of orange and violet. June rose, brushing dust from her coat. Can I come back tomorrow? Ethan hesitated, then nodded. Bring the book. As she left, Ash turned his gaze toward the door she'd gone through, ears tilted forward as though already waiting for her return. Ethan sank back onto his bedroll, staring at the horse bathed in twilight. For the first time in years, he felt the quiet stirrings of something like hope. Spring in Bridger Ridge did not arrive with blossoms or gentle warmth. It came with mud. Snow melted into rivulets that cut across the roads, turning gravel into soup and the valley floor into something unsteady. Ethan slogged through it each day, hauling scrap wood, patching gaps, trying to hold the barn together with whatever he could find. Each nail he hammered into the sagging beams sounded like a plea. Ash adjusted to the work in his own way. He had grown calmer since June began reading to him in the evenings. Often the horse would stand near the girl, head lowered, while her voice smoothed the silence. But when Ethan struck the boards with his hammer, Ash's ears would flatten, a tremor running through him. Ethan kept his strikes steady, slow, learning to breathe with the rhythm until the horse could stand it. Progress. Small and hard-won. The first letter from the county arrived folded in a brown envelope, its typewritten words colder than the wind that swept the ridge. This property has been deemed unsafe. Immediate action required. Failure to comply may result in demolition. Ethan stared at the paper in the dim light of the barn, his hands rough against the edges. He had no savings, no steady work. The $15 he'd spent had bought the barn, but not the future it demanded. That evening, Walt dropped by, his boots caked with mud. He leaned against a post while Ethan showed him the notice. Walt read it slowly, jaw tightening. They're right about one thing. The roof won't last another storm. But tearing it down, that's the easy way out for them. Cheaper than giving a man a chance. Ethan rubbed his forehead. I can't afford lumber. I can barely afford food. Walt's eyes traveled to Ash, who was chewing on dry hay. You could sell him. A Mustang like that, even half broke, would fetch enough to patch the barn proper. Maybe more. The words landed like a stone in Ethan's stomach. He looked at Ash, the pale coat, the intelligent eyes that had already begun to follow June's voice, his own footsteps, even the sound of Maya's laugh when she'd returned once to check the brand. To sell him would mean betraying something he hadn't yet fully earned but desperately needed. No, Ethan said flatly. Walt's brow furrowed. Son, pride doesn't keep a roof over your head. It's not pride. Ethan's voice was low, steady. I've lost everything else. Jobs, a marriage, every damn chance I had. If I sell him, then what's left? Nothing but another mistake. Walt studied him a long moment before nodding slowly. Then you'd better be ready to fight harder than you ever have. This valley doesn't give handouts. He left the map again, folded between boards, a quiet reminder that the land beneath their feet had its own long history of battles over ownership. The next week, Ethan tried to find odd jobs. He repaired a neighbor's broken fence, shoveled mud away from a store's front steps, anything that might bring in a few dollars. But the work was scarce, the pay small. He returned each evening exhausted, pockets nearly empty, to find Ash waiting by the barn door and June with her book already open. One night, as June finished reading, Maya appeared again, headlights cutting across the yard before her truck pulled to a stop. She carried a thermos of coffee and a folder. I checked the registry, she said, handing Ethan a sheet of paper. That brand matches a horse processed through Nevada 3 years ago. He was part of a herd rounded after a wildfire in California. Records show he was transported east, but somewhere along the way he disappeared. June's eyes widened. Disappeared? Lost in the system, Maya said carefully. It happens more often than people like to admit. Paperwork says one thing, reality says another. She looked at Ethan. Whoever abandoned him didn't care enough to follow through. Ash snorted at the sound of voices, ears pricking. Ethan reached up to stroke his neck, his hand brushing the cold lines of the brand. "Well," he murmured, "he's not lost anymore." But even as he said it, the words of the county notice echoed in his mind. If the barn was condemned, if he couldn't pay to fix it, they'd take it down. And without the barn, what then? Where would Ash go? The weight pressed heavier with each passing day. Ethan counted his coins at night by lantern light. Quarters, dimes, a few crumpled bills. $73 after a month of scraping. Not enough. Not nearly enough. One afternoon, as rain slicked the fields, a man in a suit drove out from town, shoes shining against the mud as he stepped from his polished car. He introduced himself as a representative of the county office. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice smooth but sharp, "you have until the end of the month. Either the structure is repaired to code or it comes down. And if the animal inside is endangered by its conditions, we'll have no choice but to remove him." Ethan clenched his fists, the words scraping like gravel in his chest. Remove him. Take Ash. The thought sent a rush of heat up his spine. He forced himself to keep his voice even. "I'll fix it." The man smiled thinly, like someone who had heard promises before. "Then I suggest you work quickly." He left behind the faint smell of cologne. Too clean for this valley. His car disappeared down the road, leaving only tracks in the mud that filled slowly with water. That night, Ethan sat on the barn floor, his back against a beam, listening to Ash chew hay. June read softly nearby, her voice steady, though he noticed the way her hands trembled at the word fire when it appeared in the story. He thought of her house in California, of alarms and smoke. He thought of Ash in Nevada, lost in transport, vanished into paperwork. He thought of himself, sitting here with $73 and a barn that might be torn down. He closed his eyes, the sound of June's voice washing over him. For the first time since the letter arrived, his anger gave way to something else. Resolve. He would not let the barn fall. He would not let them take Ash. He would fight, even if the fight was hopeless. Ash shifted, stepping closer until his breath brushed against Ethan's hair. Ethan opened his eyes and whispered into the dark. Words meant for the horse as much as himself. "They're not taking you. Not while I'm still standing." The sky began to darken long before the sun set. Ethan could feel the storm pressing against the valley, heavy and restless, as if the land itself were bracing. The air tasted of iron, sharp on the tongue. Clouds gathered in thick layers, swallowing the light until the barn stood in a dim twilight. Ash shifted uneasily inside, his hooves scraping. Against the floor, his ears flicking back and forth like radar. Ethan tightened the ropes holding the patched roof in place. He knew the structure wouldn't stand a serious beating. The county man hadn't been wrong. Time had hollowed the barn to its bones. Still, it was all they had. He kept working until the first drops of rain fell, fat and cold, spattering against the boards like warning shots. By nightfall, the storm had swallowed the valley whole. Wind tore across the open ground, shrieking through cracks in the walls. Rain hammered the roof, finding every weakness, dripping down in icy streams. Ethan built a small fire in a metal barrel to keep the chill at bay. June sat huddled in a blanket beside it, clutching her book, though she didn't read tonight. Her eyes darted to Ash, who moved restlessly in the shadows, muscles tight beneath his pale coat. A sudden gust slammed against the barn. One of the patched boards ripped free, clattering to the ground with a metallic scream. Ash reared, eyes white in the flickering light. His hooves struck the dirt, his breath ragged. Ethan leapt forward, raising his hands. "Easy, Ash. Easy, boy." But the wind howled again, louder, lifting a sheet of tin from the roof. It flapped like a broken wing, the sound sharp and violent. Ash bolted, crashing toward the open door. Ethan lunged, grabbing at the rope near the entrance, but the horse surged past, a blur of muscle and panic. The door banged wide, and Ash vanished into the rain. For a heartbeat, only the storm answered. Then Ethan grabbed his coat. "Stay here," he shouted to June. "Don't follow me." He plunged into the storm, rain stinging his face like needles. Lightning flashed across the sky, illuminating the valley in stark silver. Ahead, he glimpsed Ash galloping through the downpour, mane plastered against his neck, eyes wide with terror. Ethan pushed forward, boots sinking into mud, his lungs burning. The horse skidded to a halt near the frozen creek bed. Sheets of water poured down its banks, turning snow to slush. Ash pawed at the ground, trapped between the roar of the storm and the dark water rushing below. Ethan slowed, raising his hands the way Maya had taught him, shoulders relaxed, voice low. "It's all right," he said, though his chest heaved with exhaustion. "I'm here. You're not alone." Ash trembled, head tossing, nostrils flaring. Another clap of thunder split the air, and the horse backed dangerously close to the edge. Ethan took one step closer, then another, his palms open. The storm howled around them, wind tugging at his jacket, rain blinding his eyes. He stopped within arm's reach, his heart hammering. "You know me," he whispered. "I gave you beans when you were starving. I've sat in the dark with you every night. Trust me now." For a long moment, nothing moved. Then Ash lowered his head slightly, his breathing rough but slowing. He took one step forward, away from the edge. Ethan exhaled, shaking with relief. He reached out, laying his hand against the damp hide. The horse shivered, then stilled beneath his touch. Together they stood in the storm, man and horse pressed close against the fury of the night. Slowly, Ethan turned him back toward the barn. Each step was a struggle, the mud sucking at their feet, but Ash followed. Lightning lit their path, thunder rolling like the memory of old wars. By the time they reached the barn, Ethan was soaked to the bone, his muscles aching. June ran forward, her eyes wide with fear. "I saw the lightning. I thought—" "He's fine," Ethan cut in, guiding Ash inside. The horse shook violently, sending droplets flying, then lowered his head as though ashamed of his panic. Ethan rubbed his neck, his own hands trembling. "We're both fine." The storm raged on outside, tearing at the valley until dawn. Inside, Ethan sat against the wall, June curled beside the dwindling fire, and Ash standing watch once more. The barn groaned and leaked, but it held. When morning came, the valley lay littered with broken branches and scattered debris. The barn roof sagged worse than before, edges curled like torn paper. But it still stood. Ethan stepped outside, the pale sun breaking through ragged clouds, and turned back to look at the animal who had nearly bolted into death and yet had chosen to follow him home. Ash's dark eyes met his. Something had shifted between them. Not full trust, not yet, but a choice. Ethan laid his hand against the horse's damp muzzle. "We'll weather worse than this," he said quietly. "And we'll stand through it together." The storm left the valley washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet earth and pine. Broken branches littered the creek bed, and the barn roof sagged in new places, but both horse and man had endured. Ethan moved stiffly as he worked to clear debris, every muscle sore from the night's struggle. Ash followed his movements with a watchful calm, ears tilting forward each time Ethan paused, as if keeping count of every breath. Late that afternoon, the sound of another truck approached. Ethan recognized it before the vehicle even stopped. Maya's old Chevy. She climbed out, her boots sinking into the mud, a folder tucked beneath her arm. Rain had darkened her hair, and her face was set in the kind of focus that came from carrying news, whether good or bad. "You look like you fought the storm with your bare hands," she said, eyeing his soaked jacket drying on a post. "Felt like it," Ethan muttered. "But we're still here." He nodded toward Ash, who raised his head at the sound of her voice. Maya stepped into the barn, brushing damp strands of hair from her face. She laid the folder on a hay bale and opened it. "I've been digging deeper into his freeze brand. Records aren't perfect, but I found something." She pulled out a grainy photograph. It showed a group of Mustangs in holding pens, their coats dull under harsh light. In the foreground stood a gray horse, his head high, eyes bright despite the fences. Ethan leaned closer, his chest tightening. Even through the poor quality, he recognized the set of the ears, the stubborn line of the jaw. "That's him," Maya nodded. 3 years ago. After the wildfire near Redding, California, they rounded up survivors. Hundreds of horses lost, but a handful were transported to Nevada. Ash was one of them. The name felt heavier on Ethan's tongue now, not just a word he'd chosen, but something rooted in truth. "What happened after?" "That's the strange part," Maya said. "Paperwork shows he was assigned for adoption to a training facility in Kentucky, but there's no record he ever arrived. Somewhere between Nevada and Kentucky, he disappeared. The trail just stops." June, who had been sitting quietly with her book, spoke up, her voice hesitant. "What if someone left him on purpose? Like, they didn't want him?" Maya frowned. "Possible. Or maybe someone tried to keep him off the books. Mustangs carry stories. Some people see value, others see burden." She closed the folder gently. Whatever the case, he wasn't meant to end up here in this barn. And yet here he is. Ethan ran his hand over Ash's neck, fingers brushing the faint frost of the brand. "He's been through fire, storms, God knows what else. Still standing." His voice caught, softer than he meant it to. "Same as the rest of us." Ash exhaled against his palm, warm breath seeping through the cracks of his calluses. The horse lowered his head, not in submission, but in recognition. Ethan felt it, a silent acknowledgement of shared survival. Maya studied the two of them, her expression unreadable. "There's more," she said at last. She unfolded a second paper, an old Polaroid photograph. The image showed a young man in his 20s, standing beside a gray horse that looked unmistakably like Ash. The man's arm was slung around the animal's neck, his smile wide, his clothes streaked with soot. Behind them, the charred skeleton of trees marked the aftermath of fire. "This was found in the Nevada files," Maya explained. "No name, no note, just the picture. Whoever he was, he cared enough to stand with Ash in the ashes." June leaned closer, her fingers brushing the photograph. "He looks happy. Like the fire didn't take everything from him because he still had the horse." Ethan stared at the image, his throat tight. He couldn't help but wonder about the man. Where was he now? Did he know the horse had survived? Or had Ash been abandoned not by neglect, but by loss? The barn grew quiet, save for the patter of rain dripping from the eaves. The photograph lay between them, a relic of a past no one could fully explain. Ash nudged it once with his muzzle, then turned his head toward the open door, ears pricked toward the fading light. Ethan folded the picture carefully and slid it back into the folder. He met Maya's eyes. Whoever he was, he's part of the story now. And so am I. That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered in the rafters. He sat by the dim glow of the lantern, staring at the folder, the photograph, the grainy image of a horse in a pen. Ash stood near the door, his silhouette framed against the pale moonlight, steady and patient. Ethan whispered into the stillness, "You've been carrying someone's memory. Maybe now it's my turn to carry yours." Ash shifted closer, the sound of his hooves soft against the dirt. He lowered his head until his muzzle brushed Ethan's shoulder. The gesture was wordless, but it was answer enough. The folder sat on the hay bale for 2 days before Ethan could bring himself to open it again. The photographs, the records, the suggestion that Ash's story stretched far beyond this valley. They all pressed against him like a weight he wasn't sure he could carry. Yet every time he looked at the horse, standing calm but watchful, he knew he couldn't leave it buried. It was Walt who finally pushed him. One evening, the old cowboy arrived with his usual slow stride, carrying a thermos of coffee. He studied Ethan's silence, then pointed with his chin toward the folder. "If you're afraid of the past, son, you're already beaten. Better to face it head on. That horse didn't end up here by chance. Might be time you learned why." By the next morning, the decision was made. Maya offered to drive. Her truck was sturdier than Ethan's broken-down relic, and she had contacts in Nevada who might know more about the missing records. Walt insisted on coming along, claiming his memory of old roots would be worth something. June begged to join, book clutched against her chest, but Ethan shook his head. "It's not a trip for kids." She didn't argue, though her eyes followed Ash as though leaving him felt like another kind of loss. They loaded the trailer carefully. Ash stepped in without panic, though his ears flicked nervously at the sound of the ramp clanging shut. Ethan stroked his neck, whispering steady words. "Just a road, Ash. Nothing worse than the miles we've already walked." The journey stretched before them like an unspooled thread. From Montana's wide sky into the rolling plains of Wyoming, then down toward the deserts of Nevada. The land changed with each mile. Snowmelt streams gave way to dry sagebrush, then red stone rising like broken teeth from the earth. Through the windows, Ethan watched the horizon shift, his mind tangled with questions he wasn't ready to say aloud. At night, they stopped at small-town motels, the kind with flickering neon signs and thin curtains. Ethan slept in the trailer beside Ash, the horse's steady breathing grounding him against the noise of passing trucks. Sometimes, in the stillness, Ethan thought he heard echoes. Fire, crackling in some distant memory. That wasn't his. The cry of frightened animals scattering into smoke. He would wake with his palms damp, only to find Ash watching him, eyes steady in the dark. In Wyoming, they passed through a town where an old rancher remembered hearing about a shipment of Mustangs that never made its destination. He leaned on his cane, squinting into the sun. Government said the trailer overturned in a storm. Papers went missing. Half the animals got scattered. Some said they were sold off quiet, no questions asked. Others swore a few just vanished into the land. He shook his head. Never trusted paperwork to tell the truth, anyhow. The words haunted Ethan as they drove on. If Ash had been lost in such a storm, how had he survived? And why did it feel as though the horse carried the memory of every mile? On the second night in Nevada, Maya arranged for them to stop at a holding facility. Rows of corrals stretched beneath the desert sky, filled with restless horses pacing behind metal rails. The air buzzed with tension, dust, sweat, and the faint tang of fear. Ash froze the moment he stepped from the trailer. His body stiffened. Ears flat, eyes wide. Ethan felt the tremor ripple through him like an old scar torn open. Maya whispered, "He remembers." Ethan didn't move quickly. He stood beside Ash, hands open, his voice steady. "Not then. Not now. You're not behind bars anymore." Slowly, the horse's breathing slowed, though his gaze lingered on the corrals, as if staring into a mirror of his past. Inside the office, Maya pored through records while Walt swapped stories with a wrangler who still remembered the chaos after the California fire. "They brought in more horses than they could handle," the man said. "Paperwork got sloppy. Some got lost between facilities. But I do recall one gray Mustang that gave every handler hell. Smart, stubborn, couldn't be broken." His eyes drifted toward the trailer outside. "If that's him, you've got yourself a legend." That night, they camped under the Nevada stars. The desert stretched silent around them, the sky thick with constellations. Walt sat by the fire, pipe smoke curling in the windless air. "Funny thing about horses," he said. "They don't just carry men. They carry stories, sometimes generations of them. Maybe that's what you've got there, a story that refused to die." Ethan lay awake long after, listening to Ash shift in the trailer, the chain of his halter clinking softly. He thought about the man in the photograph, the one who had stood with Ash in the aftermath of fire. Who was he? Was he still alive? Still searching? Or had Ash been carrying his memory alone all these years? When dawn broke, painting the desert in copper and rose, Ethan pressed his hand against the trailer gate. Ash turned his head, dark eyes steady on him. "We'll keep looking," Ethan said softly, "until we find the truth." Ash snorted, the sound sharp against the morning air, and for the first time, Ethan thought it sounded almost like agreement. The road east stretched beneath them, long and endless, until the mountains of Kentucky began to rise out of the haze. The air grew softer, the fields greener, and the fences stretched in neat white lines across rolling hills. It was a different world from the Montana Valley where Ethan had stumbled into Ash's life. Here, tradition lived in the soil, in the way people spoke about horses as though they were both industry and inheritance. Maya had tracked the lead. A name scribbled on the back of the Polaroid, faint but still legible. Noah Bennett. A young handler once attached to the adoption program, last known to be working at a training farm outside Lexington. Ethan held the photograph in his hand as they drove, the image smudged from his touch. The man's arm draped around Ash's neck haunted him. Whoever Noah was, he had been part of the horse's story, perhaps the first person to offer him something like belonging. They found the farm on the edge of a valley where barns gleamed freshly painted and pastures rolled like green oceans. Dozens of sleek thoroughbreds grazed within white fences, their coats shining in the late afternoon light. Ethan felt his stomach knot. Ash was a stranger here, a Mustang with scars and a half-healed trust. He did not belong among these polished animals bred for speed and pedigree. Yet it was here that the truth waited. Noah Bennett was older now than the boy in the photo, though still young by Ethan's reckoning. Late 20s, maybe. He came from one of the barns, wiping his hands on a rag, his gait brisk. When Maya showed him the photograph, his face went pale. He reached out, touching the image as though it might dissolve if he pressed too hard. "Where did you get this?" he whispered. Ethan hesitated, then motioned toward the trailer parked by the road. "He's here." Noah's breath caught. Without waiting, he walked toward the trailer, his pace quickening with each step. Ethan followed, his chest tight. When Noah reached the gate, Ash lifted his head. For a moment, the horse froze, ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring. Then he gave a sound Ethan had never heard before. A low, throaty nicker that carried something almost like recognition. Noah's eyes filled with tears. "It's him," he said, voice breaking. I thought he was gone." Ethan opened the trailer slowly. Ash stepped out onto Kentucky soil, his hooves striking the gravel with sharp certainty. He stood before Noah, the two locked in a silence older than words. Noah reached out, trembling, and rested his hand against Ash's neck. The horse did not flinch. Instead, he leaned, pressing his weight into the touch. "I was there when the fire came," Noah said softly. His voice trembled, but his gaze never left the horse. "We were evacuating animals, loading trailers. Everything was chaos. I tried to keep him safe, but when the trucks left, I lost him. They told me later he never made it here. I thought he died in the smoke, and His voice broke entirely, his shoulders shaking. "I've carried that guilt every day." Ethan looked away, giving the moment its silence. He knew what it meant to live under the shadow of mistakes, to measure time by the weight of what you couldn't undo. When he glanced back, Noah's hand still rested on Ash's neck, his tears streaking down dirt-stained cheeks. "I pushed him too hard," Noah confessed, his voice raw. "I wanted him to prove himself, to be more than just another wild horse. He was smart. Too smart. I thought I could train the fire out of him, but he needed patience, not pressure. I failed him." Ash lowered his head, blowing warm breath against Noah's chest. It was forgiveness in its simplest form, wordless but undeniable. Ethan felt a lump rise in his throat. For all his own failures, perhaps here was proof that even broken bonds could find a way to mend. Noah turned to Ethan, eyes red. "You've been the one caring for him?" Ethan nodded. "Or maybe he's been the one keeping me alive. Hard to tell some days." They stood in silence, the three of them, two men and a horse whose story tied them across miles and years. In that quiet, Ethan realized something unexpected. This wasn't just about discovery or guilt. It was about choice. Whose life Ash would share now, whose path he would walk beside. Noah seemed to sense it too. He stepped back, his hand falling away. "He's found home with you," he said finally. "I can see it. I don't want to take that from him. Or from you." Ethan felt both relief and a strange ache. He had braced himself for loss, for the possibility that Ash might be claimed by his past. Instead, he had been given something gentler, the chance to keep walking forward together. As the sun dipped behind the Kentucky hills, painting the barns in amber light, Ash stood between them, calm and steady. His eyes caught the fading glow, reflecting not the fear of storms or the memory of fire, but the quiet strength of survival. Ethan reached for his halter, guiding him gently back toward the trailer. "Come on, old friend," he murmured. "The road's not done yet." The road back to Montana felt heavier than the one that had carried them east. Ethan drove in silence, his hands tight on the wheel, while Ash traveled quietly in the trailer behind them. The horse had settled after Kentucky, his eyes calmer, his breathing steady, as if the reunion with Noah had eased some weight he had carried since the fire. For Ethan, however, the burden had only grown. Maya dozed in the passenger seat, her head tilted against the window. Walt sat in the back, muttering to himself in half-sleep, the brim of his hat pulled low. Their exhaustion filled the cab like fog. Only Ethan remained restless, his thoughts circling the moment when Noah had stepped back, tears in his eyes, and chosen not to reclaim Ash. It should have brought relief, and in part it did. But alongside that relief was a truth Ethan couldn't ignore. Keeping Ash wasn't just about companionship, it was about responsibility. A Mustang who had survived wildfire, transport, storms, abandonment. He deserved more than patched boards and borrowed time. By the time they reached Bridger Ridge, the air had sharpened again with the bite of early spring. Snow clung stubbornly to the mountains, though the valley was beginning to thaw. The barn waited, weathered and sagging, a reminder of every letter from the county still tucked inside Ethan's coat. Ash stepped off the trailer slowly, his hooves sinking into the familiar dirt, ears turning to catch the faint cry of coyotes on the ridge. He shook his mane and stood tall, as though he recognized home. June was waiting. She ran from the porch of her aunt's house, breathless, book clutched in her hand. "You brought him back!" she shouted, joy breaking across her face. Ash pricked his ears at the sound of her voice, and when she approached, he lowered his head so she could brush his nose with trembling fingers. "I knew you would." Ethan managed a tired smile. "He belongs here now." That evening, after Maya and Walt returned to town, Ethan stayed behind in the barn with June and Ash. The girl read aloud while Ethan mended a broken hinge, his hands steadying with the cadence of her voice. Yet his mind wandered back to Kentucky. The gleaming barns, the white fences, the fields where thoroughbreds ran like polished shadows. He wondered if Ash would have been better off there, surrounded by care and certainty, instead of here in a half-ruined barn with a man who barely scraped by. When June finished, she tucked the book under her arm and looked at Ethan. "He chose you," she said simply, as if it were the most obvious truth in the world. That night, Ethan lay awake long after the girl had gone. Ash shifted in the corner, the sound of his breathing steady against the rafters. Ethan whispered into the dark, "Did you choose me? Or did I just happen to be the last one left?" The horse stirred, but gave no answer. Days passed, and the county's deadline loomed. Each morning, Ethan forced himself into work, patching the roof, shoring up beams, hauling stones to reinforce the foundation. His body ached, his hands cracked from the cold, but he pressed on. Neighbors sometimes watched from a distance. A few shook their heads. A few, quietly, began to help. Boards appeared on his porch, nails in small boxes. Even a roll of wire fencing leaned against the barn one morning without a note. Walt brought tools he hadn't used in years. Maya arranged a delivery of hay, pretending it was a coincidence. The small kindnesses built like unseen scaffolding, holding Ethan upright when he thought he might collapse. Yet still, he knew it might not be enough. One evening, as the sun set in streaks of red, Ash stood near the eastern fence line, gazing into the distance. Ethan walked out, his boots crunching in the frozen soil. He laid a hand on the horse's neck. "I don't know if I can give you the life you deserve," he said softly. "But I can give you loyalty. I won't leave." Ash shifted closer, his warm breath brushing Ethan's sleeve. It was not a promise of an easy path, but it was something stronger. A vow that, for once, Ethan would not run. The next morning, the county inspector returned, clipboard in hand. He circled the barn, scribbling notes, his mouth tight. "It's improved," he admitted reluctantly. "But not enough. You have 2 more weeks." When he left, Ethan sank against the barn door, his body heavy with fatigue. He thought of Noah again, of Kentucky's wide fields. He thought of selling Ash, of setting him free in greener pastures. The temptation cut deep, not because he wanted to lose him, but because he feared failing him. That night, June returned with her book. She sat cross-legged on the barn floor, reading by lantern light, while Ash stood close enough that the tips of his mane brushed her hair. Ethan watched them both, his throat tight. Maybe she was right. Maybe the horse had chosen him. Maybe they had chosen each other. When her voice faded into the night, Ethan whispered a single word into the silence. "Stay." Ash lowered his head until his muzzle touched Ethan's chest, a weight both grounding and forgiving. In that quiet moment, the choice was no longer about fear or failure. It was about presence. Whatever storms lay ahead, they would face them together. The county inspector's warning echoed in Ethan's ears long after the man's car disappeared down the road. 2 weeks. 2 weeks to repair what years of neglect had torn down. He stood in the barn doorway, staring at the sagging beams, the rotted boards, the dripping roof. The task seemed impossible. Yet Ash stood beside him, steady as ever, his breath warm in the cold air. The next morning, Ethan found a bundle of shingles on the porch. No note, no name, just left there under the dawn light. Later that day, Walt appeared with a box of nails and an old hammer polished by decades of use. "Don't ask who sent what," he muttered. "Just use it." Word had traveled quietly through Bridger Ridge. Most had written Ethan off as a drifter destined to fail, but some remembered what it meant to fight for something when you had nothing. They began to come, not all at once, but in small gestures that stitched together into something larger. A man from the feed store dropped off bales of straw, pretending they were overstock. A woman from the diner sent sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. A high school kid showed up after classes to hold boards in place while Ethan hammered. It was June who noticed first. "They're helping you," she whispered one evening as she brushed Ash's mane. "They don't want to see him, or you, lose this place," Ethan grunted, uncomfortable with the thought. He had lived most of his life moving town to town, never staying long enough for roots. The idea that people might care enough to stand with him was harder to accept than the threat of losing the barn. Yet each evening, when he returned from scavenging wood, he found another sign of quiet hands at work. Tools left leaning against the fence, lumber stacked by the gate, even jars of nails sorted neatly in coffee tins. One Saturday, as the wind bit sharp from the ridge, a half-dozen townsfolk arrived without a word. They moved with the calm efficiency of people who had built fences, barns, and homes their entire lives. Walt barked instructions while Ethan worked alongside them, sweat mingling with the sting of cold. The sound of hammers filled the valley, not harsh this time but steady, like a heartbeat. Ash stood tethered nearby, ears flicking at the noise but no longer trembling. June read to him from her book, her voice carrying above the clatter. Occasionally, the horse would glance at the workers, then back at Ethan, as if trying to measure this new rhythm of trust. By sunset, a section of the roof had been replaced, the beams reinforced with fresh lumber. The barn still looked weary, but less defeated. As the workers packed their tools, one of the older men clapped Ethan on the shoulder. "It's not finished," he said, "but it's holding. Keep at it." Then they left, as quietly as they had come. That night, Ethan sat in the hayloft, lantern flickering beside him. He looked down at Ash, who lay stretched in the straw, his body relaxed in a way Ethan had never seen before. The horse shifted, sighing deeply, as though even he felt the barn was becoming something new. Ethan rested his head against the beam and let the silence settle over him. For the first time, it didn't feel heavy. It felt like belonging. Days bled into a rhythm of work. Ethan's hands blistered and healed, then blistered again. Walt kept showing up with advice. Maya brought supplies when she could. June never missed a single evening of reading. And each time the county inspector's face returned in Ethan's mind, sharp and skeptical, he pushed harder, hammer striking nail with a certainty he hadn't known he carried. One evening, as dusk painted the valley in blue and violet, Ethan paused to wipe sweat from his brow. He looked around and realized the barn no longer sagged like a dying thing. It stood straighter, firmer, its bones stronger than they had been in decades. Ash stood in the doorway, mane catching the last light, a sentinel watching his work. Ethan smiled faintly, the weight of exhaustion pulling at him but not winning. "We're getting there," he murmured. "Piece by piece." Ash flicked his ears, then stepped forward, lowering his head to nudge Ethan's shoulder. The gesture was gentle, but sure, as if the horse himself were acknowledging the fight. The next morning, Ethan awoke to find another gift, waiting by the fence, a carved wooden sign, letters burned into the grain. He lifted it, reading the words aloud in the quiet dawn. For Ash. For home. His throat tightened. Whoever had left it hadn't needed thanks. The message was clear enough. This wasn't just his battle anymore. It belonged to the valley, to everyone who had remembered what it meant to save something fragile. Ethan hung the sign on the barn door, his hand steady despite the ache. He stepped back, Ash standing beside him, and for the first time in years, Ethan felt the future stretch wider than the horizon. Not certain, not easy, but possible. By June, the valley had shifted into another world. Snowmelt gave way to green meadows, and wildflowers pushed through the cracks of old fence lines. The barn, once sagging under years of neglect, now stood with straighter shoulders. Fresh timber shone against weathered beams, like scars on skin that told stories of both injury and healing. Ethan rose with the dawn each morning, sweat already dampening his shirt as he worked. The smell of cut wood mingled with hay, dust, and the faint sweetness of clover carried in from the fields. Ash moved freely in and out of the barn now, his coat glossy with health, his muscles filling in where ribs had once shown. The Mustang's steps carried a new weight, not just survival, but confidence. One hot afternoon, Ethan climbed into the loft to sort through the last of the rotted boards. Dust swirled in the air, catching sunlight in golden motes. As he leaned against one of the older beams for rest, his fingers brushed a shallow groove in the wood. Curious, he wiped away grime, and letters emerged beneath his hand, faded but still legible. J+E, 1967. The initials were carved deep, the kind of mark made by someone who wanted it to last longer than a season. Ethan traced the grooves with his thumb, feeling the years pressed into the wood. Whoever they had stood here once, carving a promise into the barn, as though love itself could be anchored into timber. He sat back, the heat pressing against him, and let the silence fill with imagined voices. A young couple, perhaps, sneaking into the barn during a summer storm. Laughter echoing off the beams, whispers mingling with the smell of hay. The barn had been more than shelter once. It had been a witness. When he climbed down, he told June about the carving. She tilted her head, considering. Maybe the barn remembers. Maybe that's why it feels different now. She reached to pat Ash's neck, her small hand dwarfed by the horse's frame. Love leaves traces, even when people are gone. That night, Ethan sat outside as fireflies drifted across the field like sparks. The barn glowed faintly in the moonlight, solid yet gentle against the horizon. He thought of the initials again. J+E. A story unfinished, but still lingering. He wondered if they had stayed together, or if time had scattered them the way it had scattered him. Ash wandered from the barn and stopped beside him, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed Ethan's shoulder. Ethan reached up, fingers threading through the coarse mane. Maybe they were like us, he murmured, hanging on to whatever they could, making promises they weren't sure they could keep. The horse stood quietly, the night air warm with crickets and the scent of cut grass. Ethan closed his eyes, letting the weight of years settle, not as burden, but as belonging. For once, he didn't feel like a man passing through someone else's story. He felt like part of the barn's memory, another name carved into its hidden ledger. The next day, he showed Walt the initials. The old cowboy squinted, running a calloused hand over the grooves. Saw marks like that in plenty of barns back in my youth. Folks believed wood kept secrets safe, stronger than paper. Paper burns, wood stays. He tapped the beam lightly. Whoever carved that, they meant it. Ethan nodded. Funny, isn't it? We patch the roof, fix the boards, but the past stays buried inside the grain. Walt smiled faintly. Not buried, son. Preserved. Like a horse's memory. They don't forget kindness or cruelty. Maybe barns don't either. The words lingered in Ethan's mind long after Walt left. That evening, as June read aloud and Maya stopped by with medical supplies for Ash, Ethan kept glancing at the beam in the loft. The initials weren't just history. They were proof that this place had mattered once to someone, the way it mattered now to him. Ash shifted closer to June, brushing her sleeve with his muzzle as she stumbled over a sentence. The girl giggled, correcting herself, and the sound filled the barn with light. Ethan leaned against the doorway, a slow smile pulling at his mouth. The barn didn't just hold scars of the past. It was beginning to gather new ones, softer ones, etched in laughter and patience. Later, under the heat of a summer night, Ethan carved something himself into a fresh beam by the door. Not names, not promises, just a single word: home. The letters were rough, uneven, but solid. He stepped back, running his thumb across the grooves, then looked at Ash, who stood in the doorway, as if keeping watch. Whatever storms come, Ethan whispered, this is where we stand. The horse flicked his ears, tail swishing, before lowering his head to the carved letters as though reading them himself. The gesture was small, quiet, but it rooted Ethan deeper than any nail he had ever driven into wood. By midsummer, the barn no longer groaned with every gust of wind. The new roof, patched together with fresh timber and the quiet labor of neighbors, shone pale in the sun like a scar healed over. When Ethan climbed the ladder to inspect it, he paused halfway, struck by how different the place looked from the ridge. What had once been a skeleton of decay now carried a sturdiness, a dignity. It wasn't beautiful in the polished way of Kentucky's stables, but it had the rough strength of something earned. The county inspector returned one clear morning, clipboard in hand. He circled the barn, his shoes sinking into summer grass, muttering under his breath as he studied each beam and joint. Ethan stood nearby, sweat prickling under his collar, his fists clenched in his pockets. Ash grazed just beyond the fence, tail flicking, seemingly unbothered by the scrutiny. Finally, the inspector snapped his folder shut. "You've done more here than I expected," he admitted. His tone lacked warmth, but it carried something close to respect. "The structure is sound enough to stand. We'll close the file." Relief hit Ethan in a rush he hadn't anticipated. He nodded, not trusting his voice. The inspector gave one last look toward Ash. "That horse has more people watching out for him than most towns do for their own," he said dryly, before walking back to his car. When the sound of the engine faded, Ethan let out a long breath and leaned against the fence. June, who had been hiding her worry behind the barn door, burst out with a grin. "We did it! They can't take him now!" She ran to Ash, wrapping her arms around his neck. The horse lowered his head, breathing into her hair, and for once, even Ethan allowed himself a smile. That evening, the town gathered in quiet celebration. There were no speeches, no banners, just food passed across tables, laughter carried into the warm air, and the smell of barbecue smoke mingling with the sound of crickets. People who had once doubted Ethan now nodded in greeting, their eyes softer. He felt out of place among them, yet grateful, the weight on his chest a little lighter. Later, when the crowd drifted home, Ethan lingered in the barn. The lantern cast a golden pool of light on the straw, and the new roof above seemed to breathe with the night air. June sat cross-legged in her usual spot, reading in a voice grown stronger over the months. Walt leaned against a post, pipe smoke curling lazily. Maya checked Ash's hooves with quiet precision. For a moment, Ethan simply watched them all. This barn, once just a roof bought for $15, had become something more. Not only shelter, but a gathering place, a vessel for stories old and new. When June closed her book, she lay back on the straw, staring up at the rafters. "It feels different now," she said softly, "like the barn is finally breathing again." Ethan looked upward too. Moonlight filtered through a single crack in the roof, landing on the carved word by the door. Home. He hadn't told anyone he'd etched it there, but somehow everyone seemed to feel it anyway. Ash stepped closer, his shadow stretching long across the floor. He lowered his muzzle to Ethan's shoulder, nudging him gently as if to anchor the moment. Ethan reached up, brushing his mane back. "We made it," he whispered. "Not perfect, but enough." The horse's dark eyes reflected the lantern glow. Steady and deep. Outside, the crickets sang, and the barn no longer felt like a place clinging to life. It felt alive. That night, Ethan did not roll out his bed in the corner. Instead, he lay down in the open aisle of the barn, Ash dozing near the door, June's book resting forgotten on the hay. The rafters above framed the stars through the narrow cracks, and for the first time since the auction months ago, Ethan slept without fear of what morning might bring. He dreamed of light falling across new boards, of initials carved into beams, of fireflies drifting like sparks across the field. And when he woke at dawn, Ash was there, watching, the rising sun spilling across the new roof in bands of gold. Ethan rose slowly, stretching, and whispered into the stillness, "This is ours now." The horse flicked his ears, then turned toward the open field, as if to say the future was waiting. The last days of summer arrived, soft and slow, the valley wrapped in a haze of golden light. Grass shimmered under the weight of late afternoon sun, and dragonflies skimmed the air above the creek. The barn, with its patched beams and new roof, no longer sagged in defeat. It stood as part of the land again. Weathered, yes, but alive, breathing with every creak of timber and rustle of hay. Ethan sat on the fence rail one evening, watching Ash graze in the pasture. The Mustang's coat had taken on a silver sheen in the light, his body strong and sure, no trace of the gaunt shadow Ethan had first found in the gloom of winter. June leaned against the rail beside him, swinging her legs, her book tucked under one arm. She had grown bolder in her laughter, steadier in her voice. When Ash lifted his head at the sound of her giggle, she grinned. "He listens to me more than people do." Ethan smiled faintly. "That's because he doesn't judge, just remembers." As the sun began to sink, neighbors wandered by. Some brought small offerings, fresh peaches, jars of honey, tools borrowed and returned. There were no speeches, no formal thanks, just quiet gestures that carried the weight of belonging. Walt sat in a chair outside the barn, pipe in hand, his eyes following Ash with a softness Ethan hadn't noticed before. Maya leaned against the doorway, arms crossed, her expression both proud and wistful. The evening settled into that peculiar silence of late summer, when the air is thick but not yet heavy with autumn's chill. Fireflies began to blink across the field. Ash raised his head, ears forward, tail swishing lazily. Then, as if moved by some unseen rhythm, he trotted toward the barn, his hooves drumming a steady beat against the ground. He paused at the doorway, looking back at Ethan with eyes that caught the last of the fading sun. Ethan slid from the fence and walked toward him, each step unhurried. When he reached the barn, Ash lowered his head, pressing his muzzle against Ethan's chest. Ethan rested a hand against his neck, the warmth grounding him. "We made it," he whispered, voice barely carrying beyond the door. $15 for a barn no one wanted, and somehow it gave me everything. The words weren't meant for anyone else, but June heard them. She climbed down from the fence, smiling softly. "Sometimes the world gives second chances in the strangest places," she said. "Maybe that's what this barn was waiting for." Inside, the lantern cast a warm glow across the beams. The carved word by the door, "Home," caught the light. Ethan glanced at it, then at the initials carved decades before. 2 stories, separated by time, now folded together under the same roof. Past and present, loss and belonging, all held in wood and silence. He led Ash to the stall, though the door remained open. The horse stood where he pleased these days, free to move in and out. Tonight, though, he lingered inside, lowering his head as if content to share the space with the people who had stitched his life back together. Ethan sat against a post, June beside him with her book resting closed on her lap. Walt dozed in his chair outside, smoke curling into the dusk. Maya lingered a while, then quietly left, her truck's engine fading into the distance. The barn settled into night, the sounds of breathing and crickets filling the dark. As the last light slipped from the valley, Ethan closed his eyes. He thought of the man in the photograph, of Noah's tears and forgiveness. He thought of the carved initials, love etched into wood decades before. He thought of the storm that had nearly taken Ash, and of the quiet hands that had rebuilt what the storm had broken. Above all, he thought of the horse who had stood through it all, whose presence had tethered him when everything else had drifted. Ash shifted closer, his breath warm against Ethan's shoulder. Ethan didn't speak this time. He didn't need to. The silence said enough. When night deepened, stars spilled across the sky. The barn glowed faintly in their light, no longer abandoned, no longer forgotten. It stood as a testament not to perfection, but to endurance, to second chances, to the fragile but unyielding thread between man and animal. And in that quiet, Ethan understood. This was not the end of the story. It was its beginning. Sometimes a story doesn't end. It simply becomes part of us. Ethan and Ash found their home in a forgotten barn, but there are countless other bonds between people and horses waiting to be told. If this story touched you, leave a simple 0 or 1 in the comments so we know you're here with us. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next story may be the one you've been waiting for.